Page 3 now, Ferguson, Missouri, no decision yet, but they are getting ready, preparing for the worst, hoping for the best. The governor of Missouri has declared a state of emergency already in the St. Louis region. The National Guard is being deployed to Ferguson and surrounding areas, and the FBI is warning of pending violence. All this in preparation for the decision by the grand jury on whether to indict a police officer for fatally shooting a robbery suspect.
Like it or not, and regardless of the color of the people involved, regardless of the socioeconomic standards, regardless of the history of the police department, for an individual officer, if his or her life is threatened, or if they reasonably believe it's threatened, they have the right to use force.
He also argues that putting minority police in minority communities is not the solution.
If you pursue that and it goes too far down that road, it really ends up with a form of kind of insidious discrimination that's there. And I think that it doesn't solve the problem. I think if you send a message also that to a community of color that, well, you can't trust the white officer.
The Justice Department is conducting probes into Michael Brown's death and the Ferguson Police Department.
Now, it's not just the National Guard. There's local police in Ferguson, St. Louis Police, and the Missouri State Highway Patrol will operate as a unified command for all of that law enforcement. So, is all of this suggesting that the officer will not be indicted? Do they know something? And what are the chances that he will be indicted? Joining me now, attorney, legal analyst, and Daily Ledger contributor Annalise Getz. Annalise, right now, we obviously don't know the answer to this question. We're waiting for the grand jury decision, but we do know that potentially this officer is facing some heavy-duty charges, including murder.
That's right, Graham. So we could see anything from first-degree murder to involuntary manslaughter. If, and I say if we had an aggressive prosecutor, we might see second-degree murder charges, but honestly, I think that if we see anything at all, it's more likely going to be involuntary manslaughter, so knowingly taking the life of another, but doing so under the heat of passion because there was that engagement, that argument, or in involuntary manslaughter, where that would mean the officer just acted with reckless disregard in the death of another. I don't think we're going to see either one of those charges. I think that most of Missouri feels the same way, and that's why they're bracing for this.
Right.
But that's the litany of what could come down.
You know, I was just thinking, I've sat as a reporter in many courtrooms, and at times you sit there as a person who's not a lawyer or an attorney, of course, but thinking, hey, this attorney, this prosecutor in particular, doesn't seem to be giving 100% in this case for whatever reason. Maybe he or she's just having a bad day, or maybe they don't necessarily believe in the case. Could that be a factor here?
I think that is definitely a factor, and that is why we're seeing people react already before we even have an answer. So this has been a long grand jury process. These people have been hearing testimony for almost 3 months now, so it's long, and yet he's totally thrown the rules of procedure of how you normally go about a grand jury process out the window. And what we've seen,
for example, what are you talking about?
For example, a grand jury proceeding is basically a playground for the prosecution. The same rules of evidence that apply in the courtroom don't apply in the grand jury proceeding. So you can just throw the kitchen sink at the grand jury, anything that sticks, and then you go and you take all that information and you say, this is why you should indict on this charge. He's not doing that. Instead, he's taken a very unique approach of giving what he says is all the evidence to the grand jury. So he's giving both the defense evidence as well as the prosecution evidence, and then telling the grand jury, you guys decide. He's not even telling them, I want this indictment, I want this charge. He's saying, you guys do the legal analysis, and you tell me what you think should be charged. So it's really unheard of.
So in effect, he could be, to use a term, you tell me if this is correct, the prosecutor could be, in effect, throwing the case here?
I think he is. I mean, I think it's a textbook definition of a prosecutor throwing a case, of being politically pushed into prosecuting the case. He doesn't want to do it. And so what does he do? He gives weak evidence on his side, strong evidence for the defense, and then doesn't really ask for a charge. And I think the defense attorney, I think everyone sees this, but the defense attorney in particular sees it because he let his client, Officer Wilson, go and testify in front of the grand jury, which you would never, ever let your client do, because a good prosecutor would rake them over the coals, and you wouldn't want to have your defendant subject to that. I think there was a little wink, wink, nod, nod, go ahead and let the officer come in, and instead of being raked over the coals, the officer got to stand up there, we'll sit up there, and say, this is why I acted reasonably. Don't charge me. I acted reasonably, and know that he's not going to get used and abused by the prosecutor.
But let me expand on that. Very unusual to have the accused testify before the grand jury. And it's risky, unless, as a defense attorney, I want you to put your defense attorney cap on now, unless, A, you know your client is not guilty and you think there's a preponderance of evidence that could prove that, but maybe more importantly, the visual. And I've talked about this before, but I'm going to say it again. If this officer indeed had the bruising and the scarring, especially just days or weeks after the incident, that we have heard he had, we know that he was taken to the hospital and was patched up. We've heard anything from, the eye socket exploded to very bad bruising. Either way, this is going to show a dramatic picture and paint a picture to a grand jury, is it not?
It will, but you can do all of that in theory with pictures as opposed to having the officer come in. And again, Graham, that's the kind of stuff that you would show as a defense, right? So that's something that as a defense attorney, yes, as a defense attorney, I would love to have all that evidence put before the grand jury. But it shouldn't happen because this is the prosecutor's game. This is all about the prosecutor showing the grand jury, I have probable cause that this individual committed the crime. That's why the defense attorney isn't even allowed in the grand jury proceedings, because in general, you don't see the defendants up there.
Okay, real quick, one last thing on the evidence. The DNA of Michael Brown found in the police car, and we know that he wasn't cuffed. We know that he wasn't arrested. How did that DNA get in there? It kind of corroborates the notion that the officer was possibly attacked, and his, he was cut in there, and that's how the DNA got in the car. As a defense attorney, that's probably golden for you, I would assume, if we're interpreting it correctly.
It's great. It then goes to the mindset of what Officer Wilson was thinking when he then shot the victim. Because if he was in there and there was a true altercation, that's very important evidence for his mindset. And that's what it'll all boil down to if we have an indictment.
Okay, we'll find out, I think, in a matter of days. Thanks, Annalise.